Sarah gripped Tom's hand tightly as they pulled up to the old farmhouse, its weathered siding and sagging roof framed against rolling hills and dense forest. Despite its somewhat dilapidated appearance, Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement coursing through her. This was their new home, a chance to escape the noise and bustle of the city in favor of a quieter, more peaceful existence. "Are you sure about this place?" Tom asked, his brow furrowed with concern as he surveyed the property. "It looks like it needs a lot of work." Sarah gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's what makes it perfect. Just think of all the potential. With a little TLC, this place is going to be amazing." She flashed him a wide, eager smile, her hazel eyes sparkling with anticipation. Tom sighed, resigning himself to the fact that there was no talking Sarah out of this. When she got an idea in her head, there was no changing her mind. "All right, let's give it a shot," he conceded, mustering as much enthusiasm as he could manage. As they stepped out of the car and approached the front door, a movement in the neighboring yard caught Sarah's eye. An elderly woman, hunched over and leaning heavily on a cane, was making her way towards them. "Well, look who we have here," the woman called out, her voice raspy and weathered by time. "The new tenants, I presume." Sarah and Tom exchanged a quick glance before turning to greet the woman. "Yes, that's us," Sarah replied, plastering on a friendly smile. "I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, Tom. It's nice to meet you." The woman nodded, her piercing gaze sweeping over them with a hint of skepticism. Yes, I'm Mrs. Wilkins, your neighbor from down the road." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "You've certainly got your work cut out for you with this old place." Tom cleared his throat, sensing the woman's disapproval. "We're looking forward to the challenge, actually. Hopefully, we can breathe some new life into it." Mrs. Wilkins pursed her lips, her expression unreadable. "Well, I certainly hope you know what you're getting yourselves into." She leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "This land, it has a history, you see, and not all of it is pleasant." Sarah's brow furrowed, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What kind of history?" The old woman shook her head, a shadow passing over her weathered features. "Never you mind, dear. Just be careful. That's all I'll say." She turned to leave, her cane tapping against the gravel driveway. "And whatever you do, don't go opening that door at night." Sarah and Tom stood there, dumbfounded, as Mrs. Wilkins shuffled back towards her own home. They exchanged a puzzled look, each wondering what the elderly woman could have meant by her cryptic warning. "Well, that was odd," Tom observed, running a hand through his hair. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with questions. "I wonder what she knows about this place that we don't." She turned to Tom, a determined gleam in her eye. "We'll have to ask her more about it later." Tom sighed, already knowing that look. "Sarah, I don't think we should be poking around in the neighbor's business. She seems a bit eccentric, to say the least." "Oh, come on, Tom," Sarah insisted, gently nudging him with her elbow. "Where's your sense of adventure? Don't you want to know what kind of history this place has?" She gestured towards the farmhouse, her excitement palpable. There could be all sorts of fascinating stories just waiting to be uncovered. Tom couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm, even if it did make him a bit uneasy. All right. I suppose a little harmless investigating couldn't hurt." He sighed in resignation. "But if the old lady starts going on about curses or ghosts, I'm out of here." Sarah beamed, grabbing his hand and practically dragging him towards the front door. "Deal. Now, let's get inside and start exploring our new home." As they stepped over the threshold, Sarah couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, adding to the sense of history that permeated the space. She could practically feel the stories of the past whispering from the walls, just waiting to be uncovered. Tom, on the other hand, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The old woman's warning echoed in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder if they had bitten off more than they could chew. Still, he knew better than to dampen Sarah's enthusiasm, so he forced a smile and followed her as she eagerly explored the house, her curiosity insatiable. As the day wore on, the couple set to work unpacking and settling in, their efforts fueled by a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Sarah guests found herself drawn towards the front door. Sarah, no. Tom reached out, his hand grasping her wrist, but she gently shook him off. It'll be fine, Tom, she said, offering him a reassuring smile. I'm just going to take a quick look, that's all. With that, she turned and made her way towards the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the entrance, the scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. Sarah paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, a sense of apprehension settling over her. She glanced back at Tom, who sat rigid in his chair, his face etched with worry. Don't open it, he mouthed, his eyes pleading with her to heed Mrs. Wilkins' warning. Sarah took a deep breath, her curiosity burning brighter than her fear. Slowly, she turned the handle and pulled the door open, revealing nothing. The porch was empty, the night air still and silent. Sarah peered out into the darkness, her brow furrowed in confusion. What the she began, but the words died on her lips as a sudden movement in the shadows caught her eye. A dark figure, barely visible in the dim light, stood just beyond the threshold, its form shifting and undulating like a mirage. Sarah felt her heart leap into her throat, her breath catching in her lungs. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There's something out there." Tom was on his feet in an instant, his face ashen. "Sarah, get away from the door," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. But Sarah was frozen, transfixed by the sight before her. The figure seemed to drift closer, its presence radiating a palpable sense of menace. She caught a glimpse of something that might have been a face, but the features were indistinct, almost ethereal. "Tom, help me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She knew she should close the door, retreat to the safety of the farmhouse, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Tom rushed to her side, his hands grasping her shoulders. "Sarah, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get away from the door, now." Snapping out of her trance, Sarah allowed Tom to guide her back, his grip on her firm and unyielding. As they retreated, the figure at the threshold seemed to follow, its presence looming and oppressive. Once they were safely inside, Tom slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the farmhouse. He fumbled for the lock, his hands shaking, and Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tom, what did we just see?" Tom shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I think Mrs. Wilkins was trying to warn us about that." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The memory of the figure's unsettling presence seared into her mind. "We have to tell her," she said, her voice laced with determination. "She must know what's going on, and maybe she can help us." Tom hesitated, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm not sure I want to get involved in whatever darkness is lurking out there." He cast a nervous glance towards the door, as if half expecting the figure to reappear. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her expression earnest. "Tom, we have to do something. We can't just ignore this, not after what we've seen." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Besides, don't you want to know what's really going on in this place?" Tom sighed, his shoulders sagging in resignation. "I suppose you're right," he conceded. "But I've got a bad feeling about this, Sarah. Something about that thing." He shuddered, the memory of its unsettling presence still fresh in his mind. Sarah gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "I know, Tom. But we've got to try, for our own peace of mind, if nothing else." She offered him a small smile, her eyes filled with determination. "And who knows, maybe Mrs. Wilkins can shed some light on the situation." Tom nodded, his expression still troubled. "All right, let's go," he said, his voice laced with trepidation. "But the moment things start to feel unsafe, we're out of here." "Understood," Sarah nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Understood." With that, the couple set out into the night, determined to confront the elderly neighbor and uncover the truth about the dark presence that had invaded their new home. The air outside the farmhouse had grown thick with tension, the shadows seeming to press in around Sarah and Tom as they hurried towards Mrs. Wilkins' home. Tom's mind raced. The image of the strange, unnatural figure on their doorstep burned into his memory. As they approached the neighbor's modest cottage, a flickering light shone through the windows, casting an amber glow onto the worn wooden siding. Tom felt his heart pounding in his chest, his palms damp with sweat. He glanced at Sarah, whose expression was taut with concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if that _thing_ is still out there, waiting for us?" Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We have to try, Tom. We can't just ignore what we saw." Her brow furrowed, a hint of worry creasing her features. "Besides, maybe Mrs. Wilkins can help us understand what's going on." Tom sighed, knowing he couldn't dissuade her. Once Sarah had made up her mind, there was no turning back. "All right, let's get this over with," he conceded, squaring his shoulders and striding towards the front door. Sarah followed closely behind, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath their feet. As they approached the porch, the old wooden planks creaked under their weight, and Tom couldn't help but wince at the sound. half expecting the dark figure to materialize once more. Before he could second-guess himself, he reached out and rapped firmly on the door, the hollow thud echoing through the stillness of the night. They waited with bated breath, seconds stretching into an eternity, until the sound of shuffling footsteps reached their ears. The door swung open, revealing Mrs. Wilkins, her weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern she held in her hand. Her eyes widened with recognition, a flash of, was it concern, flitting across her features. "You too," she said, her voice raspy and tinged with an undercurrent of wariness. "I must admit, I'm surprised to see you out here at this hour." She cast a wary glance over their shoulders, as if searching for something, or someone, in the shadows. Sarah stepped forward, her expression earnest. "Mrs. Wilkins, we need your help," she began, her voice wavering slightly. Someone, was at our door tonight, and we don't know what to do." The old woman's face darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I warned you," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow and regret. "I told you not to open that door at night." She shook her head, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. Tom felt a surge of frustration, mingled with a growing sense of fear. "You knew something was out there," he accused, his voice rising slightly. "Why didn't you warn us properly? What is it that's lurking around our home?" Mrs. Wilkins held up a weathered hand, silencing him. "Keep your voice down, young man," she admonished, her eyes darting warily towards the trees that lined the edge of her property. "What's out there? It doesn't take kindly to being disturbed." She motioned for them to enter, her expression grave. "Come, quickly, before it decides to follow you." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, their unease palpable, but they dutifully followed the elderly woman into the modest confines of her home. The interior was warm and cozy, lit by the flickering flames of a fireplace, but the air was heavy with an undercurrent of trepidation. Mrs. Wilkins led them to a worn, overstuffed armchair and gestured for them to sit. "Make yourselves at home," she said, her voice low and somber. "We have much to discuss." As they settled into the chair, Tom felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease, but only slightly. He couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The memory of that dark, ominous figure seared into his mind. Mrs. Wilkins pulled up a chair of her own, the worn wooden frame creaking under her weight. She fixed them with a penetrating stare, her eyes narrow. "So, you've encountered it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her expression one of equal parts curiosity and dread. "Yes, we saw someone, standing on our doorstep. It was..." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "It was terrifying." Mrs. Wilkins let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders sagging. "I had hoped it would leave you be, at least for a little while. But it seems the entity has already taken an interest in you." She shook her head, a shadow passing over her weathered features. Tom leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Entity? What are you talking about? What is this thing that's been lurking around our home?" The old woman's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing with a mix of fear and determination. "It's a dark presence, a malevolent being that has haunted this land for generations." She paused, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of the armchair. "It feeds on the curiosity and disobedience of those who dare to venture out at night, and it will stop at nothing to claim their souls." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Claim their souls," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean, it's supernatural?" Mrs. Wilkins nodded solemnly. That it is. An entity of pure darkness, neither living nor dead, that has been drawn to this place by the sins of the past." She leaned forward, her gaze boring into theirs. "And now, it seems, it has set its sights on you." Tom felt his heart pounding in his chest, his palms growing clammy. "But why us?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "What have we done to attract its attention?" The old woman's expression softened, a hint of sympathy flickering in her eyes. "Nothing, my dear boy. You and your wife have done nothing wrong. But the entity, it's drawn to the curious, the ones who dare to defy its warnings." She reached out, her weathered hand grasping Tom's with surprising strength. "And by opening that door tonight, You've given it exactly what it craves. Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat, her mind racing with 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears. So, what do we do? She asked, her voice small and tremulous. How do we stop it? Mrs. Wilkins squeezed Tom's hand reassuringly. There may be a way, but it will be perilous. The entity must be confronted, its power broken, if you are to have any hope of reclaiming your home and your lives. Tom swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. And if we can't? The old woman's gaze darkened, a shadow passing over her features. Then I fear the darkness will claim you, just as it has claimed so many others before you. The weight of her words hung in the air, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames in the fireplace. Sarah and Tom sat in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in, as they realized the true nature of the threat that now loomed over their new home. The flickering flames of the fireplace cast a warm, amber glow over the cozy interior of Mrs. Wilkins' cottage, but the oppressive weight of her words hung thick in the air, making it difficult for Sarah and Tom to breathe. What do you mean, the darkness will claim us? Tom asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. There has to be a way to stop this. This entity you're talking about. Mrs. Wilkins sighed, her weathered features etched with a deep sorrow. I wish I could tell you that it's a simple matter, my dear, but the truth is, this is no ordinary threat. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the flickering flames. The entity that has set its sights on your home. It is a malevolent force, ancient and powerful, that has plagued this land for generations. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. But why us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What have we done to deserve this? The old woman shook her head, her expression softening. You've done nothing, child. This is not a matter of deserving or not deserving. The entity, it is drawn to the curious, the ones who dare to defy its warnings. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. And by opening that door tonight, you've given it exactly what it craves. Tom felt a surge of panic, his heart pounding in his chest. So, what are we supposed to do? Just sit back and let this thing destroy our lives? He ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed with worry. There has to be a way to stop it, to protect ourselves. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. There may be a way, but it will be perilous. She reached out, her weathered hand grasping Tom's with surprising strength. The entity must be confronted, its power broken, if you are to have any hope of reclaiming your home and your lives. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Tell us, please. What do we need to do? The old woman's expression grew grave, the lines on her face deepening. The entity is drawn to the sins of the past, to the darkness that has tainted this land for generations. She paused, her gaze shifting between the two of them. To defeat it, you must first understand its origins, the twisted history that has given it power. Tom felt a chill run down his spine, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. What do you mean? What kind of history are we dealing with here? Mrs. Wilkins sighed, her eyes clouding with a lifetime of sorrow. Many years ago, this farmhouse and the land around it were the site of a great tragedy, a dark ritual performed by a cult that sought to harness the power of the supernatural. She paused, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of the armchair. In their pursuit of unholy knowledge, they unwittingly unleashed a force of pure evil, a malevolent entity that has haunted this place ever since. Sarah felt her stomach twist with a growing sense of dread. And this entity, it's the same thing that's been terrorizing us. The old woman nodded solemnly. Child, the very same. It has grown in strength over the years, feeding on the fear and curiosity of those who dare to venture here, especially at night. She fixed them with a penetrating stare, her eyes hardening. And now, it seems, it has set its sights on you. Tom felt a surge of nausea, his mind reeling with the implications of Mrs. Wilkins' words. But how do we stop it? How do we protect ourselves from something so powerful? Mrs. Wilkins reached into the pocket of her worn cardigan, producing a small, leather-bound book. This journal, she said, her voice low and solemn, contains the key to understanding the entity's weaknesses and how you might be able to confront it. She handed the book to Sarah, her weathered fingers trembling slightly. It was written by the last person to dare challenge the entity's power, a young woman who lived in this farmhouse many years ago. Her expression grew somber, a shadow passing over her features. Tragically, she did not survive the encounter, but her knowledge may yet be your salvation. Sarah took the journal, her hands trembling as she traced the intricate patterns on the worn leather cover. And you think we can use this to stop the entity? Mrs. Wilkins nodded, her gaze intense. It will not be easy, child. The entity is cunning and powerful, and it will stop at nothing to claim you as its own. She reached out, grasping Sarah's hand with surprising strength. But if you are willing to face the darkness, this journal may be your only hope. Tom felt a surge of fear, his mind racing with 1,000 doubts. But what if we can't do it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we're not strong enough to defeat this thing? The old woman's expression softened, a glimmer of sympathy in her eyes. Then I fear the darkness will claim you, just as it has claimed so many others before you. She paused, her grip on Sarah's hand tightening. But you must try, for if you do not, the entity will continue to haunt this land, preying on the curious and the disobedient for generations to come. Sarah felt a surge of determination, her fingers tightening around the leather-bound journal. We'll do it, she said, her voice steady and resolute. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to stop this entity and reclaim our home. Tom opened his mouth to protest, but the unwavering conviction in Sarah's eyes silenced him. He sighed, his shoulders sagging in resignation. All right, he said, his voice laced with trepidation. If there's a chance we can stop this thing, then I'm in. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, a faint flicker of hope in her weathered features. Then you must be prepared, my dear children. The road ahead will be treacherous, and the entity will stop at nothing to break your will. She fixed them with a stern gaze, her eyes shining with a mixture of concern and determination. But if you are to have any hope of prevailing, you must face the darkness head-on, with courage and unwavering resolve. Sarah and Tom exchanged a weighted glance, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on them. But as they turned their attention back to the old woman, they knew that there was no turning back. They had to confront the entity, to reclaim their home and their lives, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, they steeled themselves for the battle to come, the flickering flames of the fireplace casting an ominous glow over the pages of the journal that held the key to their salvation and their very survival. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as Sarah and Tom returned to the farmhouse, the journal clutched tightly in Sarah's trembling hands. Mrs. Wilkins's warning hung heavy in the air, and a palpable sense of dread settled over them. As they approached the front door, Tom paused, his gaze sweeping the darkness beyond the porch, half expecting the ominous figure to reappear. Are you sure about this, Sarah? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. After what we've seen, I'm not sure I'm ready to confront whatever thing is lurking out there. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her expression resolute. We have to try, Tom. We can't ignore this, not after everything Mrs. Wilkins told us. She held up the journal, its worn leather cover catching the faint glow of the porch light. She said this might be our only hope of stopping that entity. Tom sighed, his shoulders sagging with resignation. I know. But what if we're not strong enough? What if we can't defeat it? He shook his head, a shadow of fear passing over his features. I don't know if I can face that thing again. Sarah squeezed his arm, her eyes filled with determination and empathy. I'm scared too, Tom, but we have to try at least. We can't just let this darkness consume us, or anyone else who might come after. She paused, her gaze softening. And remember, we're in this together. I won't let you face it alone. Tom nodded, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. All right, let's do this. He reached for the door handle, his grip firm and resolute. As they stepped back into the farmhouse, the air seemed to thicken with tension, the shadows looming larger and more menacing than before. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, the memory of the ominous figure on their doorstep still fresh in her mind. Wordlessly, they made their way to the kitchen, where they had first encountered the strange scratching sound. Sarah placed the journal on the table, its worn cover a stark contrast to the pristine, untouched surface. "Okay," Tom began, his voice trembling slightly. "What does the journal say we need to do?" Sarah opened the book, its pages crackling as she gently turned them. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she scanned the faded, handwritten text, her lips moving silently as she read. "It talks about a ritual," she murmured, her eyes widening with fascination and trepidation. "Something to weaken the entity's hold on this place and disrupt its connection to the dark forces that sustain it." Tom leaned in, his gaze fixed on the journal's pages. "And how do we do that?" Sarah continued reading, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of the text. "It says we need to gather certain items, candles, herbs, a copper bowl, and something called a moonstone." She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Do you have any idea where we'd find those things?" Tom shook his head, his expression pensive. "No, I have no clue, but I guess we'd better start looking, huh?" He glanced around the kitchen, his gaze settling on the various drawers and cabinets. "Maybe we can find some of that stuff here, in the house." Sarah nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "It's worth a try." She turned her attention back to the journal, her brow furrowing with concentration. The ritual also calls for some kind of incantation, a specific set of words to be spoken during the ceremony. Tom felt a chill run down his spine, the word incantation sending a jolt of unease through him. "You mean, like, magic?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Sarah shrugged, her expression uncertain. "I don't know, Tom, but if this is the only way to stop the entity, we have to at least try." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination and fear. "We don't have any other choice." With a heavy sigh, Tom relented. "All right, let's get started. The sooner we can do this ritual, the sooner we can get our home back." He paused, his expression darkening. "And hopefully, the sooner we can be rid of that thing for good." For the next several hours, Sarah and Tom scoured the farmhouse, searching for the items mentioned in the journal. They rummaged through drawers and cabinets, unearthing candles, bundles of dried herbs, and an old copper bowl that had been tucked away in the pantry. The search for the moonstone, however, proved to be more challenging. They combed through every nook and cranny, but the elusive gemstone remained elusive. Just as Tom was about to give up, Sarah let out a triumphant cry. "I found it," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. She held up a smooth, grayish-white stone, its surface almost luminescent in the soft glow of the kitchen light. Tom stared at the stone, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Are you sure that's the right one?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Sarah nodded emphatically. "Yes, I'm sure. The journal describes it perfectly. A moonstone, pale and shimmering, like the light of the moon itself." She grinned, her enthusiasm infectious. "We've got everything we need to perform the ritual." Tom couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension, but he knew there was no turning back now. "Okay, let's do this," he said, his voice laced with determination. "The sooner we get this over with, the better." Together, they set up the ritual space in the living room, arranging the candles in a circle and placing the copper bowl at the center. Sarah carefully arranged the herbs, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Tom watched, his muscles tense with anticipation. Once everything was in place, Sarah opened the journal and began to recite the incantation, her voice steady and confident. The words flowed from her lips like a haunting melody, and as she spoke, Tom felt a strange tingling sensation prickle the back of his neck. Suddenly, the candles flickered and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and contort, as if responding to the power of the incantation. Tom felt his heart hammering in his chest, and he instinctively reached for Sarah's hand, gripping it tightly. As the final words of the incantation echoed through the room, the air grew thick with a palpable tension, and the shadows seemed to coalesce, forming a dark, amorphous shape that loomed over them. "Tom, look," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Tom's gaze snapped towards the shadowy figure, and he felt a chill run down his spine. It was it, the ominous presence that had haunted their doorstep, its formless shape shifting and undulating, as if it were made of the very darkness itself. "Don't break the circle," Sarah whispered urgently, her grip on his hand tightening. The journal said the ritual would weaken the entity, but we have to keep our defenses up. Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the swirling mass of darkness before them. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. The entity seemed to sense their trepidation, and it surged forward, its shapeless form pressing against the invisible barrier of the ritual circle. Tom felt a wave of pure terror wash over him, and he had to fight the urge to bolt from the room. "Sarah, I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's too strong, too evil." Sarah turned to him, her expression resolute. "We have to, Tom. We've come too far to give up now." She squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I'm right here with you. We can do this together." Tom took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He knew Sarah was right. They had to confront this darkness, no matter the cost. With a renewed sense of determination, he tightened his grip on her hand and faced the entity, his gaze unwavering. The battle that followed was a harrowing one, a clash of wills and raw power that threatened to consume them both. The entity lashed out, its formless tendrils of darkness seeking to breach the ritual circle, while Sarah and Tom fought to maintain the integrity of the sacred space, their voices joining in a desperate chant to keep the entity at bay. Time seemed to stand still as the struggle unfolded, the candles flickering and the shadows dancing, the very air crackling with a primal energy. Sarah and Tom poured every ounce of their strength into the ritual, their resolve unyielding, until finally, with a deafening roar, the entity was forced back, its presence dissipating into the darkness. Exhausted but victorious, Sarah and Tom collapsed into each other's arms, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had faced the darkness and emerged triumphant, but the cost had been high, and they knew that the true test was yet to come. As they surveyed the damage to their home, the weight of their ordeal settling upon them, they knew that the battle was far from over. The entity had been weakened, but it was not vanquished, and they would have to remain vigilant, for it would surely return, seeking to reclaim what it had lost. With a deep, steadying breath, Sarah and Tom turned to face the uncertain future, their eyes shining with a renewed determination. They had taken the first step in reclaiming their home and their lives, and they would not rest until the darkness that had haunted this place was banished for good. The first tendrils of dawn were just peeking over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the battered farmhouse. Sarah and Tom sat huddled together on the worn sofa, their bodies battered and bruised from the harrowing confrontation with the entity, but their spirits unbroken. Sarah's gaze was fixed on the journal, its pages still open to the ritual they had performed, her fingers tracing the faded text with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Do you think it worked?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we drove it back, but did we really defeat it?" Tom let out a heavy sigh, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I don't know, Sarah. That thing, it felt so powerful, so ancient. I'm not sure any ritual could truly destroy it." He shook his head, his brow furrowed with worry. "I'm afraid it's still out there, waiting, biding its time until it can strike again." Sarah nodded, her expression somber. "I was afraid you'd say that." She leaned into him, seeking the comfort of his embrace. "What are we going to do, Tom? We can't just live in fear, waiting for it to come back." Tom pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his fingers running through her tangled hair. "I don't know, love, but we'll figure it out, I promise. We survived this once, and we'll do it again if we have to." He paused, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Besides, you know I'm not one to back down from a fight, especially not against some ancient, supernatural thing." Sarah couldn't help but chuckle, despite the gravity of their situation. "That's true. You always were the stubborn one." She tilted her head up to meet his gaze, her eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and concern. "But this isn't like a fight with a bully, Tom. This is something otherworldly. I don't know if we have the strength to face it again." Tom's expression softened, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Hey, we're in this together, remember? And if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you're the bravest, most determined person I've ever met." He paused, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had escaped her eye. "We'll find a way, Sarah. I promise. Sarah nodded, leaning into his touch. Okay, she whispered, her voice laced with resolve. Then let's start by figuring out what we're up against. She glanced down at the journal, her brow furrowing in concentration. This book might hold the key to understanding the entity and how to stop it for good. Tom followed her gaze, his expression hardening. Right, and we need to find out more about the history of this place, too. Mrs. Wilkins said the entity was drawn to the sins of the past. Maybe if we can uncover that history, it will give us a better idea of how to defeat it. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with 1,000 questions. Then that's where we'll start. We'll scour this house, dig up every bit of information we can find, and figure out a way to end this once and for all. She paused, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Even if it means confronting that thing again. Tom squeezed her hand reassuringly. We'll be ready this time, Sarah, and we won't be alone. Mrs. Wilkins said she'd help us however she can. He offered her a determined smile, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. We're going to win this, I know it. With a deep breath, Sarah and Tom rose from the sofa, their bodies aching but their spirits unbowed. They knew the road ahead would be arduous, fraught with challenges and dangers they could scarcely imagine. But they were determined to reclaim their home and their lives, no matter the cost. As they set out to explore the farmhouse, their senses heightened. Sarah couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The entity had been weakened, but it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the chance to strike again. And she knew that the next confrontation might not end as favorably as the last. The day was spent meticulously searching every nook and cranny of the farmhouse, scouring the walls and floorboards for any clues about the property's dark history. Sarah pored over the journal, her brow furrowed in concentration as she attempted to decipher the faded, barely legible text, while Tom scoured the attic and cellar for any forgotten documents or artifacts that might shed light on the entity's origins. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the weathered walls, Sarah's eyes finally landed on a passage that made her blood run cold. Tom, come look at this, she called out, her voice laced with a mixture of dread and fascination. Tom hurried to her side, his expression etched with concern. What is it? Did you find something? Sarah nodded, her fingers trembling as she traced the words on the page. It says that the entity is not truly defeated, not even by the ritual we performed. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. It's only weakened, Tom, and it will continue to grow stronger until it can reclaim this place and the souls of those who dare to defy it. Tom felt his heart sink, a wave of despair threatening to overwhelm him. So, all of that, everything we did. He shook his head, his expression crumbling. It was for nothing. Sarah reached out, grasping his hand tightly. No, Tom, not for nothing. We bought ourselves time, precious time, to try and find a way to truly banish this entity for good. Her grip tightened, her eyes burning with determination. And we will find a way, I promise you that. Tom took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze meeting hers. All right, then, what do we do next? Sarah turned her attention back to the journal, her mind racing. The journal says that the entity's power is tied to the land, to the very history of this place. If we can uncover the truth about what happened here, maybe we can find a way to sever that connection, to weaken it beyond recovery. And how do we do that? Tom asked, his voice laced with trepidation. I'm not sure, Sarah admitted, her expression troubled. But Mrs. Wilkins might know more. She said she'd help us, and I think it's time we paid her another visit. Tom nodded, his jaw set with determination. Then that's what we'll do. We're not going to let this entity win, Sarah. Not after everything we've been through. With renewed purpose, the couple set out into the gathering dusk, their steps quickened by a sense of urgency. They knew that the entity was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. But they were no longer willing to cower in fear. They were ready to face the darkness head-on, no matter the cost. As they approached Mrs. Wilkins' cottage, the flickering porch light cast an ominous glow across the weathered siding, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. The memory of their previous encounter was still fresh in her mind, a stark reminder of the power and malevolence that they were up against. But this time, they were armed with knowledge and a renewed determination to reclaim their home and their lives. With Mrs. Wilkins' guidance, they knew they might just have a chance of defeating the entity once and for all. With a deep breath, Sarah reached out and knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was fraught with peril, but she was ready to face it, come what may. For the sake of their home, their lives, and their very souls, she and Tom would not back down. Not now, not ever. If this story has captured your imagination, consider subscribing and supporting our content. Your subscription enables us to craft more thrilling narratives for your enjoyment. We value your support and thank you for engaging with our mysterious world.